Charlie, what do you mean you went somewhere where there are planes, aircraft, big metal birds, and you didn't tell me that there were big birds and planes and that I should go there? Like,
You
where
were
is the
already going to
decent?
Germany. And also you had to get lots of permission because there was a NATO exercise going on.
Oh, please, permission, smermission, whatever the hell. Haven't you heard of like a hood classic thing called a break-in? What is this? What is this Anglo politeness of needing to follow rules?
You'd have got shot.
Well, there's tons of Russian spies that get by somehow. I'm sure that I would be able to match their skills.
For those who don't know what Kat's talking about, I spent a few days last week on an airbase in the northern Netherlands watching and reporting on the largest air exercise with 91 jets from 15 countries, practicing how they would respond to an Article 5 situation, not just from Russia, but that was clearly on a lot of people's minds. And they were practicing a lot of things that they had learnt from observing the air war in Ukraine. And I did think of you, Kat, when I was standing in front of the press tent watching all those E5s, Gripens, Eurofighters, Hornets, etc. taking off, feeling the roar of the engine reverberate through me. You'd have loved it.
Well, you may have seen a bunch of military jets, but I got to fly on two planes with Margot via Amsterdam, actually.
Civilian, then, I take it.
Yeah, no. We flew on an F-16 from London to Amsterdam and then on a Gripen from Amsterdam to Germany, definitely. But it's actually quite difficult to fly with a cat. But thankfully, the flights were short. So take that. You haven't flown with Jasper yet. Between your legs, deciding
Well,
to
most
pee on
airlines
me.
would have to put him in the hold, and I wouldn't do that to him.
Actually, fun fact,
Oh.
not most. A huge ton of them. I will at some point dedicate a separate episode to my crusade against IAG Cargo, which is like the big company among European airlines that deals with pets and cargo. But at least you, unlike me, haven't been graced with having your cat pee on you in the middle of passport control. So you may have seen
I don't
military
blame
jets.
her.
You may have seen military jets, but I got deposited on by my own very grateful cat.
I don't blame her. Airports are a stressful place for anybody. Welcome to All Out on the Eastern Front, a podcast where we talk about the most important stories from Eastern Europe and Eurasia each week. I'm Charlie Hancock, a journalist at the Moscow Times, and I write about European security at Crisis Europa Substack.
And my name is Kat Shengelia. I'm an MA student at King's College London with a 4,000-word essay due on Monday. I want to be journalist.
Oh,
and
I have
currently...
2,000-word essays due at the start of
bro,
next week.
that's so real. And currently a recipient of death stares of my cat. I'm not sure as to the cause just yet. Maybe we can get Bellingcat to investigate Margot, and for once I'll try to actually, be able to understand the emotion this lobotomized being is experiencing.
Bellingcat was actually tracking down stolen dogs.
You know, we thought pandemic was back, bad. Now I'm like, can we bring back the pandemic? I prefer like stolen dogs tracked over like dead kids. But before we start, one quick note. No guest today. Sorry to disappoint you guys. Also deal with it because getting peed on yourself in the middle of passport control and having to do a bunch of family related stuff, that can chip away at podcast research.
Not directly related, we should say.
Not directly related, but we're just going to do a little parody of just the two of us.
Wasn't bringing people together through knowledge one of the reasons why we wanted to set this up in the first place?
Like, I feel like I want to go back to the caveman times instead. I mean, you look at some Russian MPs and they do look like some Paleolithic humans or something
definitely.
like that.
There are some people you look at and you think you look more Neolithic than other people.
What's crazy is that I did 23andMe. We decided to look at the Neanderthal component. I have more Neanderthal DNA than like a huge chunk of 23andMe customers. So I am, in fact, monkey.
Well, you're quite short. And Neanderthals were quite short.
Enough of domestic abuse against me. You have some domestic, I'm not sure, abuse you want to levy against Georgescu. What's going on in Romania? You are our chief Romania correspondent.
Well, we're about halfway through April, which means it won't be long until Romania has a second crack at its presidential election. Listeners will remember that last year, Georgia's constitution... Georgia? Kat, you're getting into you're whizzing away into the mind. Although I did have Georgian food again the other night, so maybe it's that. Still in my bloodstream.
The covert Georgian propaganda.
Is it covert? I think it's pretty overt at this point. But listeners will remember that last year, Romania, not Georgia's Constitutional Court, I nearly said Georgia again, ordered that the election be rerun after evidence emerged of foreign interference that catapulted anti-NATO, anti-Ukraine candidate Kalin Georgescu. That's why I was thinking about Georgia, as well as the food, Georgescu. But anyway, he was catapulted from obscurity when polls first opened to second place in the first round of elections, and he was projected to potentially win the runoff. Since then, Georgescu has been banned from running and is currently under investigation on 6 counts, including running a fascist organisation.
I mean, we also remember the screams among the far right outside of Romania and the Trump administration kind of flexing its muscles, talking about, restricting Georgescu is restricting free speech. But I wonder if maybe there's a secret, list of to-do things that Georgescu is just trying to, complete before he dies. Some people, they want to go to Niagara Falls.
A bucket
see
list.
The pyramids.
Before you kick the bucket.
Yeah, and he...
that might be why it's called a bucket list, actually. I just realised.
Maybe. But maybe he's just trying to do, a far-right bucket list. Run for presidency, get a bunch of charges against you, run a fascist... Because otherwise, I can't explain how this one man is managing to do all of this.
The world's most problematic Make-A-Wish kid. But it has been potentially quite a consequential week in the Romanian election. First off, the former Prime Minister and current presidential candidate Victor Ponta is facing calls to withdraw from the race, even from the current Prime Minister, after he admitted on a podcast that he allowed 4 Romanian villages to be flooded in order to protect the Serbian capital of Belgrade from floods in 2014. He was given honorary Serbian citizenship for this.
What? No way. But what is it with, podcasts becoming these platforms where, the moment you go on it, your, political filter just vanishes and people are, gonna admit to, murder and all sorts of different things. Yeah, I trafficked drugs to underage children in 2012 or something. It's crazy.
Yeah, well, what is also crazy is that although he's running on a very explicitly nationalist platform, a lot of people have questioned whether Romania should have a president that puts other countries before their own and then accepts honorary citizenship from them as a thank you. Ponta told the podcast that the villages were evacuated beforehand and later defended his decision to Politico, saying that he'd always prioritise human lives over farmland. Elsewhere in the campaign, the Liberal USR party announced that they would support the current mayor of Bucharest, Nica Jordan, instead of their own candidate, Elena Lasconi. This is particularly notable because Lasconi actually won the first round of last year's election, still quite narrowly, but officials in the party say they want to avoid a situation where the Liberal vote is split, resulting in 2 anti-European candidates going through to the final round of the election. Dan is currently polling at 22%, behind George Simeon, who is well ahead at 31%, according to Politico's poll average. With Georgescu out of the way, Simeon is a far-right candidate to watch. He backed the former last year. He is banned from entering Ukraine, having demanded that Kiev show more respect to Ukraine's Romanian minority, which sounds kind of familiar. He's painted himself as warmer towards Brussels and NATO than Georgescu, but that doesn't mean he'd be an easy political partner in a very important country. Analysts have pointed out that the Romanian far right has learned that it's a much more sensible electoral tactic to be anti-Ukrainian than pro-Russian, because Romania, having a history of authoritarian rule and being invaded in itself, most people don't particularly like their government cozying up to a state that is doing just that. Simeon told the Telegraph newspaper recently that if elected, he'd rip up a defence agreement where Britain and Romania would work together to support Kiev and train Ukrainian troops, unless Ukraine was to respect the rights of the Romanian minority, churches and Romanian schools.
I genuinely know very little because I know like the Hungarian minority has been a big talk. Never encountered Romanian minority, at least in Kiev or Lviv. But
They'd be more around the Carpathians, I believe.
yeah, there'll be more around the Carpathians. But again, I'm not against obviously like multicultural Ukraine because Ukraine is that. It's just a little bit difficult to do a bucket list of how to make Ukraine more diverse in the middle of an invasion. But there's another topic, not about Romania, but about disease. Charlie, are you vaccinated?
Well, I'm vaccinated against many things. You can hear Robert Kennedy Jr. screaming somewhere in the horizon.
I was about to literally say that RFK is going to have you catch bullets and everything.
Yeah,
with the
he said the other day
outbreak.
that he wants to try and find the cause of autism within 5 months, which makes me think that he's just going to come out at the end of 5 months with something that's obviously not going to be the cause of autism, but he's going to want to have something to show for this.
Well, do expect that vaccines suddenly will cause autism. But you're going to be talking about foot and mouth disease, which I never heard of. And why is it called foot and mouth? Just what?
Well, it's a nasty virus that affects cows mostly, and it causes lesions on the foot and in the mouth, hence the name. It can affect other animals. It's caused some problems when pigs have been infected, and it can, in extremely rare cases, infect humans. But those cases are so rare that there hasn't been a reported incident in the UK since 1966. So you can calm down about there being, well, a pandemic from that source.
Just don't tell the foot fetishists about this virus or it's over for us. I will say, I really prefer not to go, for our podcast to not go in the discussion of feet. But what's funny is when you talked about this disease, I really don't remember it because in East Europe, I'm sure that it exists, but majority of issues with diseases that exist in East Europe is the fault of health mummies who don't vaccinate their kids. So you have chickenpox and measles and stuff like that. I think there was a case a couple years ago in Ukraine where a mom falsified documents to let her child go to a kindergarten, and then another kid who was immunocompromised unfortunately died. So
you're hearing this, America? You're hearing this?
Well, I mean, I don't think RFK cares too much about that. If you look at the
they'd
doctors
probably
he's
go,
been praising.
But Slavic women, so beautiful and unvaccinated.
I mean, I think there are websites for these types of people where you can actually explicitly put that you're not vaccinated.
You can do that on Hinge.
On Hinge?
But you have to pay to filter out all the unvaccinated people, or filter out the vaccinated people if that's your thing.
Well, there you go. But what about the disease? Because, okay, you've had it in the UK, and
yeah, and I have
was it a big thing?
Vague memories of the 2007 outbreak, which was pretty small, but brought back a lot of traumatic memories in the rural community I grew up in of the 2001 outbreak, which was devastating as farmers had to cull thousands and thousands of their livestock. Some of our listeners might remember the images of burning mounds of cattle, and it cost the equivalent of about £23 billion today, and that doesn't even, Cat's eyebrows have shot up, and that doesn't even begin to give you a picture of the scale of the disaster it was for so many businesses and communities. Foot and mouth has recently been found in Germany, Slovakia, and Hungary.
Germany #1! Yeah! Let's go!
It was found in Germany in January and Slovakia and Hungary in March. And this week, the UK actually banned travellers from bringing meat and dairy products into the country for personal use to try and stop the disease spreading. So no bringing back any German sausages, Kat.
I remember actually last year returning from Ukraine, and I'm on a minibus, right? Because you can't fly, and there were no train tickets because I booked last minute, as always, and I'm in a bus with a bunch of women from different parts of Ukraine, and they're all bringing back salo, which is meat, and which theoretically you cannot bring into the EU. I started telling them that, hey, this could be confiscated, you could be fined. The whole bus was eating away at that salo, destroying it, and there was still more salo in the back, but
I don't think that the border control was doing its job of like checking for meat products. So a bunch of people brought in meats into the EU. I mean, it was for personal use, but I don't know how the UK is going to stop very determined Ukrainian women from bringing back salo. They will find a way because there's nothing that gets in the way between well-priced salo and a Ukrainian who knows that they're not going to be back home for quite a while.
Well, there might be more places in the UK where you can get salo.
Maybe, but then it's going to be more expensive. And we are cost sensitive.
Increased demand as a way to induce an increase in supply?
I don't think when it comes to foods like salo and holodets, I don't think that there's ever going to be an increased demand.
Well, clearly you need to organise the Ukrainian community in the UK to demand more salo.
I don't want to end up on some food propaganda watch list, okay? Like I may have like enough problems with immigration as is. So wait, so you have this disease. You have Slovakia closing zoos. You have bans of bringing products. But what's happening in these countries? Like, how widespread is the effect of this disease, or is it just a couple cases here and there?
Well, it's been found in 4 farms in Hungary so far, but that has still resulted in the killing of thousands of animals and a lot of damages to local businesses. But the political response has been quite interesting because Hungary, these cases, they were the first ones to be found in 50 years and they were detected along its borders with Austria and Slovakia, has made headlines after Viktor Orban's chief of staff, Gergely Gulyas, told press that the outbreak could be caused by a genetically engineered virus, saying it cannot be ruled out that the virus was not of natural origin.
I can already predict what's going to be happening next. It originated from a Ukrainian lab, or it originated from a Chinese lab. Place your bets now, which one is it going to be?
Ukrainian or Chinese? Well, he said that he based that suspicion on verbal information from a foreign laboratory, caveating that nothing had been proven fully or documented. And I wanted to bring this story up not only because it's another case of a Hungarian politician being provocative, but because of their potential economic impact, especially when Europe is facing not only the pressures of the invasion of Ukraine, but Trump's trade war. It's
trade war? Mr. Trump, could you please not put tariffs? I'm sorry.
It's possible that if enough cattle or pigs are affected, it could drive up the cost of meat and dairy quite significantly. Then there's the impact on regional economies. A lot of people outside farming don't realise how expensive it is to run a farm and how tight your margins are. I mean, maybe these days people have a better idea thanks to Jeremy Clarkson's farm, which has proved a hit with some of my Russian colleagues, actually. I remember one colleague striking up a conversation with me as I was coming into work about all the red tape and council meetings that Clarkson had to go through in order to get a farm shot and restaurant set up. I have this memory of this really nice and very philosophical colleague shaking his hands in the sky saying that it was like in the Soviet Union.
What do you mean it was like in the Soviet Union? Have you have you not seen all the memes about like the Russian passport offices? If you want to go and get your passport to change your last name, there was like a comedic skit from Comedy Club before they, became complacent in the war machine, so to speak, where this guy comes into the passport office and he's like, I provided you a photo 3x4, 4x3. I provided you a photo of 30 centimeters by 40 centimeters by 30 centimeters. I provided you evidence of me belonging to the human race. And they will still find a way to reject you and basically say, yeah, you don't have enough documents.
That sounds like a Cotswolds parish council.
Councils in the UK and passport offices in Russia trying to compete who can be more insufferable.
Yeah, I mean, to give you an example of that farmer I mentioned who had lost, 3,000 of his cattle were liquidated, is the word I saw being used, and I think that's the most appropriate one in this case. He told Reuters his business had already taken a $4 million loss.
Well, speaking of disease, sort of. We're gonna go from disease to Russian soldiers, and the reason I mentioned disease is actually because this week the Russian government has actually expanded the list of what kind of diseases a soldier is allowed to fight with. So hepatitis A, B, C, D, E, F, G, or whatever. That's good to go. You can fight with that. So the diseases that previously were no-nos on the front line because of, the adverse effects it could have not just on the soldier who is contaminated, so to speak, but the effects that could have on his colleagues, that doesn't seem to be an issue anymore. But why exactly am I discussing Russian soldiers? Well, I wanted to take a bit of the time, since this is a laid-back episode, to talk about what's happening in the Russian army, because it's definitely a doozy. So, there's an article that caught my attention on foreign policy. Why don't Russian soldiers revolt? By Amelie Tolvin. She's a visiting scholar at the University of Helsinki Alexanderi Institute for Russian and Eastern European Studies. And it's a good question because for the past couple months, Russian Telegram channels and mill bloggers began to talk more and more about what's taking place on the Russian side of the front line. Now, in contrast, before I'll describe the Russian side, yeah, there were also abuses in the Ukrainian side of the front line. However, at least the people in command who are exposed of abusing their soldiers, they generally tend to get prosecuted. This doesn't seem to be happening in Russia. So you have videos, for example, of Russian soldiers. They stand in front of the camera, all of their faces are covered, and they're talking about, for example, how their commander is sending them on meat grinder waves and operations that have like a negative gazillion success rate.
For those of our listeners who don't know what a meat grinder is, historically it was basically throwing as many men as possible at the problem. But these days it's changed a little bit. They will send up maybe a fire team of 2 or 3 individuals towards a Ukrainian front. Then the Ukrainians will target them, kill these guys, and then they will just send up successive waves. And the intention is to just attrit through any of the equipment that the Ukrainians have.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's been the old traditional meat waves as well. We've seen that as well.
They've kind of moved away. They've moved away from that really since 2023.
But what's interesting is that in these videos, you have Russian soldiers who themselves are talking about the kinds of abuse that are taking place on the front line. So you have violence that is like directed both at and among soldiers, and it remains this large tool for enforcing discipline. You have reports, but also these videos that come out from Russian soldiers who basically say that if we refuse to go and assault the Ukrainian soldiers, we get zeroed. Again, we mentioned this term before, it just means executed. You also have punishment pits, right? So literally pits into which soldiers will be thrown at half naked, and the elements are quite aggressive in winter, right? The temperature drops quite severely. They get beaten and have rocks thrown at them, among many things. You have intoxicated soldiers who have killed civilians, Ukrainian civilians, Russian civilians.
These are very alarming headlines, but if anybody who's been reading about some of the conditions that Russian soldiers have been subject to when they do their mandatory military service, where it's got to a point where abuse is almost taken as a given.
Wait. Don't spoil the article. Hold up. We'll get into it in a second. Don't spoil it. But you have, and what's interesting is I actually remember quite a lot of posts on social media talking about like, look how hardcore, like there was one, and I don't know if it's real or not, but basically there's like an urban myth that one of the ways Russian soldiers or special security services personnel get trained is that they get locked in a dark room with an aggressive dog, and they have to basically either die or kill the dog.
And then you have some people getting a hard on by looking at all of these Russian soldiers having, I don't know, branches broken over their backs, and then saying, but our military is full of the queers.
Yeah, but there's lots of these like videos where abuse is sort of venerated, even though what it creates when you have this amount of violence that is taking place in a military, right? Because what you expect is a military to be disciplined and professional. This pattern of violence, it goes completely unpunished. And when soldiers are killed extrajudicially, their deaths are often disguised as combat losses or attributed to desertion, which also then proceeds to have an impact on their family members, right? Because most Russian soldiers right now are contractors. So if your husband didn't die, but for example, deserted or has gone AWOL, which is oftentimes what the families of these soldiers will be told, you can't receive the payment for them getting killed. Now, you may ask, and this is kind of what Tolvin is talking about. If you're treated like crap, you would probably usually try to change your circumstances. And for a while now, many hoped that that would happen.
Can I spoil it now?
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, it's what they expect, isn't it? Being subject to violence and sexual violence and other forms of abuse when you take your mandatory military service as a Russian man, it's not a surprise anymore. It's common knowledge, and there's even a cultural sense that it's what makes you going through that.
Well, there you kind of touched on two things, which is one, the gender aspect and the cultural aspect of things, but also just the social status of it. And this is what Tolvin sort of talks about. To quote, some observers have advanced sweeping cultural theories, suggesting that Russians are beset by a unique fatalism and nihilism. Others have argued that soldiers' motivations may stem from a genuine belief in the conflict. Marlene Laurel and Ivan Grek, actually, I met Marlene Laurel because I studied at GW. She's a nice lady. They both argued that the war provides an opportunity for the restoration of male self-worth, which has been like a huge cultural thing in Russia since before the full-scale invasion, of like Russian men constantly sort of needing to compensate for supposedly destroyed masculinity and male worth, which like dying for a president who completely doesn't care about you and has multiple baby mamas that he's giving yachts from your taxes, I think that that's probably a little bit more damaging to your self-worth than, I don't know, an LGBT couple, but I digress. Additionally, they say that millions of Russians at the bottom of social ladder accept this because they can emerge as the country's true heroes, ready for kind of the ultimate sacrifice. But there's one thing that she highlighted which I found incredibly interesting. Now, of course, she pointed out exactly what you said, which is how such high level of casualties, it is a product of ingrained culture of violence within the Russian military, and that it creates a cycle of behavior which is then routine. And it conditions soldiers to accept things as is, as the norm, and obviously destroys their will to dissent. There's another thing, which is this legacy, I'll quote, this legacy of and repeated exposure to violence teaches them not only to acquiesce to violence, but to actively participate in it, even to the extent that they defy the rules of war. Those who do engage in such brutality, such as one of the brigades accused of committing war crimes in Bucha, are often rewarded by the government, which further normalizes and entrenches lethal violence in the Russian ranks. One thing she didn't highlight, which maybe there was a reason why she didn't, but Tolvin didn't highlight the widespread presence of prisoners. Violence is massive in Russian prisons and in prison culture, and obviously because of all the restrictions in Russian academia by the government, we can't know the whole truth on the impact of presence of prisoners and prison culture.
But Svetlana Stevenson is worth reading on that subject.
Yeah, but other scholars definitely have done the job. Again, I'm not saying it's a bad article. It could be just, not her scope. Now, what's interesting, the one point I want to make, and what we can observe, and to what I want to reroute attention, is to how this violence is then rerouted toward the Russian public. It's a much bigger question, one to which people will have different answers to, as to why the Russian public tolerates violence of ex-combatants against them, right? Multiple cases of soldiers returning from the front line killing the elderly, children, their wives. But increasingly, it becomes apparent that the high level of repressions, combined with widespread complacency and sort of this, I don't even know what's a good word for it, but just kind of like acceptance of the situation as is, and the desire to be apolitical, is having a direct impact. And that impact can be directly measured in caskets.
Well, from that, we're going to return to the Caucasus, but not Georgia. I had Georgia on my mind earlier in this episode, and now Kat's going to be talking about a couple of other countries.
It's truly treacherous and tragic that I'm not focusing on Georgia, although there were news, but it's difficult to forgo an episode without mentioning my motherland. But I do want to give some light to a topic we discussed before, which is the bumpy peace process between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Well, we discussed it, but it was sadly lost to the mists of time.
No, we discussed it twice. We discussed Armenia and Azerbaijan twice. Once in an episode that did get published. Thank you very much. And
that
once
was the one
in
with
an
Nick,
episode,
wasn't? That was the first
and the
one
with
Nick.
Nick, we love you. I'm so sorry. That episode unfortunately is lost to time. You know, when we talk about Caucasians, our definition of Caucasians, not white people, peace processes are always going to be more dramatic. And it seems like Armenia and Azerbaijan are following this trend. So, for the past couple days, if not weeks, Azerbaijan continues to accuse Armenia of supplying inaccurate minefield maps, claiming that they are only 25% accurate. The Azeri Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Ayhan Khazijada, Jesus Christ, I need to improve my Azeri last name reading skills, stated that the maps handed over by Armenia marked the location of only 400,000 mines, but there's actually 1.5 million.
Well, that's okay. On what grounds do they have that data?
Listen, there are certain mysteries of the region that I can't even begin to describe. Just accept that this is what they're saying, right? So the Azeri parliament in turn called for international pressure on Armenia to provide accurate minefield maps, and the foreign ministry appealed to the international community to recognize the urgency of demining efforts. Now, Armenians have not been sitting still. They've expressed their sort of readiness to verify the accuracy of the minefield maps with international experts. However, political analyst whose origin you'll be able to guess by his last name, Robert Yevondian. Mr. Yevondian, I apologize if I mispronounced your last name.
I think it might be a Revondian. Or I might be overdoing the Khe, but there's definitely a scratchy G in Armenian.
In the words of Miley Cyrus, nobody's perfect. I gotta work it again and again till I get it right. So,
I'll take your word for it.
He suggested that Azerbaijan is using the minefield issue to basically portray Armenia as the disruptive party.
Who could have predicted?
Yeah, thereby justifying Baku's refusal to sign a peace agreement that has been agreed upon in all other respects. The funny thing he pointed out is that Baku is sort of expecting that there's going to be all this international pressure on Armenia. But he, and I fully second his opinion, doesn't believe that such pressure will materialize because nobody at this time cares. Like, nobody cares about what's going on in Georgia. Nobody cares what's going on in the Caucasus region in general because we have tariffs and the full-scale invasion. However, he doesn't believe that Baku will escalate this crisis into a full-scale war, which I really hope is going to be the case. Yevondian believes that Baku is basically just trying to lower the international community's expectations of Azerbaijan, while at the same time maintaining its trust. In other words, Azerbaijan wants to quote, present the situation in such a way that any failure to sign the agreement is due to fears and concerns caused by Armenia's alleged unconstructiveness. Obviously, we don't know how all of this is going to proceed. I don't even know what further concessions Armenia is going to have to make in this situation, but unfortunately, we go back to sort of the usual thing that takes place in post-Soviet states where you kind of just deny, and shift blame, and shift blame, and shift blame. And in the end, it's not the oil oligarchs of Azerbaijan who will suffer, but Azeri civilians and Armenian civilians.
Oil oligarchs who are given a degree of leniency in Europe because Azerbaijan has been an important source of fossil fuels since sanctions were imposed on Russia. How many of those fossil fuels are actually laundered from Russia is a separate matter.
Well, maybe Azerbaijan should focus more on its aircraft getting shot down by the Russians, which I'm sure they are, but I digress.
That's kind of brought us full circle. We've started talking about aircraft and we'll end talking about aircraft.
Well, Charlie, if we're kind of going to round 2 of this episode, should we also talk about the foot fetishists, or should we call it a day?
I think we'd better leave our inboxes unbesmirched. Well, that's it for this week. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of All Out on Eastern Front. Join us next Sunday on either Spotify or YouTube. And don't forget to subscribe so you get an update for when we have our next episode out.
Please, wait, please subscribe. Please.
Kat, I think if you keep talking like that, we'll lose subscribers.
Oh, God.
Well, if you like what we do after hearing Kat's voice, the software we use and the food for our cats, our jet-setting cats, won't pay for themselves. So a link to our Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee pages will be provided in the show notes.
You can get in touch with us via Twitter at Hancock2001 and at Eshenhelia. And if you can't spell our last names or usernames, do not worry. The links to our social media accounts are also available in the show notes below.
You'd be surprised how many people spell Hancock incorrectly.
Damn, and I felt bad about my spelling mistakes in English, like for the word bureaucracy.
That one comes from French. That's a difficult one.
I don't even know how to read. So, I don't know what you're talking. Spelling, grammar, don't know anything about it.
What that? Just caveman woman. You're too Neanderthal.
And on that note, we hope to see you next week for more discussions about our journey to truly become monkey. And maybe a little bit of East European politics on the side.
See you next week.